There's a very strong power in knowing a story and standing in the place where the story happens. We were right by that mountain where the story happens. So and I've loved these stories since I was 14, and I was like, we're going up that mountain. So we got to tell that story on top of that mountain. So that was one of my most magical storytelling experiences, to be able to do that.
What is the relationship between a story and the land upon which it is told? Is there only one true version of any given story, or are there many versions, like roots or branches of a great tree? I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today we will explore some of these questions, explore them with the Hungarian storyteller Csenge Zalka. She joins us from Budapest, where she works as a storyteller and as a researcher into the many varieties of story on this earth. Thank you for joining me. Let us begin. Well, hello, Csenge. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Csenge, I wonder if you'd be willing to start us off with a story.
Yes, I actually brought a story that I am working on now. So it's new in my repertoire, but I really love it. So I thought that I would bring something new to this show today. This is not really a folk tale. It is a legend from Transylvania. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a hill somewhere in northern Transylvania. It wasn't particularly tall or grand. It was just a hill. And on this hill lived a fairy girl. And she was beautiful. And her name was Virág, which means flower. And she took on that name because she loved flowers. She had her own garden planted on top of that hill, and she worked in her garden every day. And she didn't only love the garden flowers. She didn't only adore the roses and the lilies and the geraniums, but she also loved everything that other people might have considered weeds. She loved the poppies and the dandelions and all the other things that just grew around her garden outside on the hillsides. And she was happy there. In fact, she was so happy on top of that hill in her garden that she decided that she was only going to marry a man who equally loved her and her garden. So every time a suitor came to court her, she always watched to see what their reactions were to the flowers. And she often found that they did not care for nature at all. And they didn't look twice at any of the flowers. They just wanted to court her and then propose to her. So she turned all of them down. And time went by, and she had 99 suitors turned away when one day a poor man came by. And he was wearing this dusty cloak and this dusty hood, but he was a young man. And as he was traveling from one village to the other, he stopped at the hill and he visited the garden. And he saw this beautiful girl working with the flowers, and he liked her. So he stayed in the village for a couple of days, and every day he visited her, and they talked and they flirted a little. And after a few days, he worked up the courage to propose to her and ask her to be his wife. But she said the same thing that she told so many others. She said, "I'm sorry, but I promised myself that I would only marry a man who loves me and my garden equally. And in the few days you've been here, you've never looked twice at the flowers. You never complimented anything in the garden. And I don't think that we would be a good fit." Well, he said, "Well, yes, but that's because I was admiring your beauty." And she smiled and she shook her head and she said, "I'm sorry, but my garden is very important to me." Well, in that moment, the stranger, he took off his dusty cloak and his hood, and there he stood in very elaborate, rich clothes. And he reached into his bag and pulled out a golden crown, and he put it on his head. And he said, "Do you recognize me now? I am King Mátyás. I am the king of this land." Would you like to marry me now? I could make you a queen. And she bowed her head and she said, I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but my answer is still no. I will only marry someone who loves me and loves my garden. And if you made me a queen, I would have to live with you in your palace. And when would I find the time to do gardening? And when would you find the time to garden with me, even if you wanted to? So the king, who was a very wise king, realized that he was not going to change her mind. And he thanked her and said goodbye, and he went back to his palace. But in his palace, there was a young gardener who just loved his job more than anything else. And when the king got home, he saw him working in the gardens and he thought, well, maybe I should send him to visit that girl. So he wrote a royal letter about nothing of importance, and he handed this letter to the young gardener and told him to take this letter to that little hill somewhere in northern Transylvania and hand it over to that girl. And he was right. The moment the young gardener and the girl saw each other, they instantly liked each other. And the gardener looked at all of those flowers in the garden and he was amazed. And well, one thing led to another, and they fell in love and they got married. And they lived very happily on that hill. In fact, the king gave them that entire hill and the lands around it as a wedding present. And they planted flowers all over that hill and they lived there. And people around in the villages started calling that hill Virághegy, the hill of flowers. But time flew by. Years passed and decades passed, and the young couple was very, very happy. But while the husband, the gardener, kept growing older, the wife, the fairy, she stayed the same. Because fairies don't age the same way humans do. And they lived a very long and very happy life together, but eventually the gardener grew old and he passed away. And Virag buried him there on the hill, and she planted his favorite flowers on his grave. And she kept tending to the flowers and she kept tending to the garden. And even though she was a widow now, she wasn't alone. Because people from the neighboring villages would come to ask her advice, to ask for her help. They knew that she had magic. They knew that she had power and that she was very wise and she was very kind and she was always ready to help them. And help was needed. Soon after, news came from the east that the Tatars were coming again. Back in those days, Tatar invasions were frequent in Transylvania, and whenever they came, they destroyed everything in their wake. And people fled to the forests, to caves, to the rivers, to islands, to the marshlands. They tried to hide from the Tatars, and they were looking for places to take their children and their few belongings and to survive the invasion, because whoever was captured was taken into slavery. And when they heard that the Tatars were coming, the Tatar army was moving so fast that people had to run. And as they fled to the Hill of Flowers, and they begged Virag, the fairy woman, to help them, to save them. So she led them to the little valley behind the hill. And there they hunkered down and they waited, hoping that the Tatar army would just pass them by. Maybe they would burn the empty village, but at least they wouldn't kill the people. But as they were waiting and huddling together and praying, they could hear the sound of hoofbeats closer and closer, and they knew that the Tatar army was coming to the valley, that they found the path that led to the valley. And they all looked at the fairy woman, and she gathered all of her power, and she wove a spell. And that spell turned everybody in that valley into plants. Many of them turned into flowers. Somebody who had beautiful blue eyes turned into a forget-me-not. And somebody who had rosy cheeks turned into a rose. And somebody who was tall and slender turned into a lily. And some of the men who were holding makeshift weapons in their hands turned into thorn bushes. They turned into hawthorn and blackthorn and briar. And they all filled up the valley with their leaves and their petals and their scent. And by the time the Tatars arrived to the valley, they could find nothing there except all of these flowers and all of these bushes. And the valley was so beautiful that they decided to stop and camp. But as the first one led his horse to one of the bushes and the horse tried to take a bite from the leaves, the thorns stabbed the horse and the horse reared up and galloped away, and all the other bushes started moving their branches, and the horses started neighing and throwing off their riders, and there was chaos and panic. And wherever the Tatars warriors turned, they were faced with thorns and the whispering of the leaves that did not sound natural. And eventually they all ran away scared, and they fled so fast they never, ever, ever came near the village or the valley again. And they were gone. Virag wove another spell, and she turned the people back into their original shapes. And then they could return to their village, and she could return to her garden. And they lived on just as they did before. They say that the hill is still there. It is still covered in beautiful, beautiful flowers. They still call it Virághegy, the hill of flowers. And who knows? Maybe the fairy woman still lives there somewhere today.
Wow, that's a wild story. Where did you find this story?
This is actually a string of little stories. I was researching magic as it appears in Hungarian folklore, magic and magicians, and I really wanted to find some stories with female magicians. And I was looking at the catalog of Hungarian folk legends. We have a 12-volume book series that catalogs all of our legends. And I found this reference to a woman turning people into flowers to hide them from the Tatar invasion. So I started looking up the sources that were cited. And there are 6 or 7 different sources that are, 2 or 3 lines. But they make a whole story if you put them next to each other, interestingly enough. They were all collected in the same area of Nagybánya in Transylvania. And the Flower Hill is actually there. It can be visited. So I looked up all of these collections of legends, and then I put the little pieces of this story next to each other, and that's how this story was made.
Wow. And have you been to that hill?
No, but I would really like to go. I go to Transylvania every fall for a storytelling festival. So next time I go, I really want to visit.
Yeah. And what's the conception, both in your mind and in Hungary as a whole, of fairies? How are they envisioned usually?
Well, Hungarian fairies are the humankind, not the little ones with the butterfly wings. It's our fairies usually look like humans, except more beautiful, and they often marry humans as well. Where I come from in northwestern Hungary, fairies are water creatures because we have a lot of rivers there. So they are associated with the waters of the Danube and the lakes in the area. And they live in castles underwater, and their hair turns into gold, and that's why you can find gold in the water. So they are associated with the rivers and the lakes. And then in other legends, mostly in Transylvania, they have castles. A lot of castles are said to have been built by fairies. And then in our classic, folk tales are wonder tales or fairy tales. They usually have a queen called Tündér Ilona. Tündér is the Hungarian word for a fairy. And she can be the jealous type. She can be a villain occasionally, and she can also be the beautiful princess at the end of the story, or the queen that rules over fairyland. So we have this concept of fairies being much like humans, but much more beautiful and with longer lives.
For me, growing up in the U.S., the word fairy either described a harmless, sort of magical, cutesy sort of being, or else was used on the schoolyard to insult particularly a boy who was seen as weak. Then later on, I experienced the conception of fairy in Celtic mythology, where they are much more dangerous and fierce, snarly beings. Are fairies in Hungarian culture ever hostile to humans?
Yes, we have a specific kind called szép asszony, which literally means beautiful woman. and they are the kind of noontime spirit that does many of the same things that also were said about witches. They are the ones responsible for changelings, for example. But they can, charm a person if he meets them. There is also a very intriguing story that I found from Transcarpathia, which is the northeastern corner of the Carpathian Basin. Used to be part of Hungary, now it's part of the Ukraine. It's a very mixed population of various cultures living together. And when I was researching stories from a particular storyteller, her name was Pályuk Anna, and she had this story where she kept asking people where the fairies have gone, because we have legends of the fairies leaving, much like in Lord of the Rings. They don't live with us anymore for various reasons. And she kept asking people where they have gone. And then she set out, she tells this is a folk tale, but she tells it in first person. So she said that she set out with her spinning to be done, and she walked and she met this strange man, and he told her that he will tell her what happened to the fairies if she gives him all the thread that she spun. And so he tells her this story about how at one point people caught a fairy woman leaning over the bed of a little child. And because child mortality was high back in those days, people decided that the fairies must be responsible for killing the children. And then his story says that the people literally hunted down all the fairies into extinction. It's a very dark story. But then the storyteller continues that she gives him all of the thread that she spun, and she goes back home. And by the time she gets back home, her mother says, "Look, some stranger came and left all of this cloth for you. He said that this is yours because you worked for it." And then she realizes that the man that she'd been talking to might not have been human. So this story ends with a question mark about whether or not fairies were actually guilty of what they were accused of, and whether or not they were actually extinct.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. And what's the Hungarian word for fairy again?
Tündér.
Thank you. So growing up, did you have a sense that the landscape around you was inhabited by magical beings?
I was very lucky that my family told me a lot of stories when I was a child, especially my father's father, my grandpa, still carries a lot of the local legends and the local tales of his village. And I spent a lot of time with him. And so his stories kind of filled the landscape around me. So I recognize these things in the stories. I recognize all the stories about the water fairies and the water sprites because we spent a lot of time in those woods and in those riverlands. But I did have a lot of books. Hungarians are lucky because we have famous folktale collections that kids grow up with. So I had one of them is called the 77 Hungarian Folktales, and it's something that most kids encounter as they are growing up. And there is also a very famous cartoon series. It's 100 Hungarian folktales represented in cartoons that I watched a lot as a child. So Hungarian children of my generation were very lucky that we grew up kind of aware of our folk heritage and our folktales.
In my childhood in the U.S., I craved magic and wonder, as all children do, as all adults do. And for me, I found that often in the forest, where there was a sense of the wild and of things unknown. But I also found it in outer space, that is, in my imagination of outer space, which was fostered by the science fiction I watched, both in TV shows and in movies. Growing up in Hungary, where did you find that sense of magic and the unknown in your childhood?
Well, I was a very creative child. As I said, I spent a lot of time with my grandpa, who was kind of a trickster figure. So he did fill everyday life with all of these little bits of magic, and I really loved mythology. I just somehow that was my earliest interest was mythology way before we actually learned it in school. And I did enjoy imagining these things around me and just finding those tiny little things, the first flowers in the spring, and hunting for mushrooms in the woods, and it was very easy to connect those to the stories that I heard growing up.
And how did you become a storyteller?
Well, the first time I decided I wanted to be a storyteller, I was like 13 or 14 years old, and I was reading Lady Gregory's Gods and Fighting Men. And I loved Irish hero tales, and I loved stories about bards. And I decided I wanted to be a bard. I wanted to be a Celtic bard specifically for some reason, and I really enjoyed those stories. And then, of course, I was told that that's not a career option, so I ended up going to archaeology. That's what my first degree is in. I studied archaeology, but I went there, I think, because there you can touch the stories, or you can piece the stories together for yourself when you're an archaeologist. Um, and when I was in college, I accidentally found out from the internet that people called storytellers do exist, and it is a profession that you can do and get paid for. And and I instantly knew that this was what I wanted to do. It was a revelation of, oh yes, this is a thing, this is a job that I can do. And I immediately, if you know the Storytel listserv, it was an email list for storytellers, mostly American, but also from other countries. And I joined the listserv, and I sent this email about, hey, I'm in Hungary, I want to be a storyteller. And then I had about 50 emails by the next morning from people around the world, greeting me and sending me all of this advice. And then I just printed a bunch of flyers and sent them out to places. And I decided I was a storyteller now, and that's how it started.
Wow, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, I was 21 at the time.
That's very cool. And perhaps I should say for our listeners that the book that you just mentioned, Gods and Fighting Men, is a book which is filled with stories of Finn McCool, who is a legendary superhero of Ireland and northern Scotland, who has various friends with him and goes on all kinds of adventures. And it's funny you mentioned that. This morning I was taking a walk in my part of town here, Ithaca, New York, and I went by this place where they're digging out a hill. These huge excavators are like tunneling away at this hill. And I thought they were just going to build a small house, but now it's clear they're building like some giant apartment thing, because they're just going down to the bedrock, just tunneling in, digging out the earth. And I was reminded of the Finn McCool story, where they dig into a hill in order to get something from the fairy world. So it's just amazing how these stories are all around us.
Yeah, I that story. Well, the one where Fionn actually accidentally grows old when he
Yes.
jumps into the lake, comes out old, and then they dig into the fairy hill, so to force them to change him back. When we had the Fest Storytelling Conference in Ireland a couple of years ago, we had a festival after that I stayed for because I was invited to perform, and we were right by that mountain where the story happens. So and I've loved these stories since I was 14, and I was like, we're going up that mountain. So all these other storytellers are like, we don't know what you're doing, but we're going with you. So we all go up the mountain, and the lake is there, and the hill is there. It's actually a very old tomb that is still on that mountaintop. And so we got to tell that story on top of that mountain right when it actually happens, and I've loved all of these stories since my teenage years. So that was one of my most magical storytelling experiences, to be able to do that.
That's terrific. Let's all go to that hill. It's interesting thinking of my growing up in America. For me, I picture myself in a house, the house I grew up in, looking at the TV, which is a box, of course. And on that TV, you've got, for example, Captain Kirk and Spock. And what relation do they have to the willow tree outside, to the oak tree? And I think the big answer for me is none at all. Those were stories dreamed up far away in Los Angeles or whatever, and shared among Americans with no relation to the local place. Now, in another sense, of course, my brother and I and our friends, we would try to put those stories, we would put those stories in the neighborhood where we lived, in the forests. Not just Star Trek, of course, but also Lord of the Rings, superheroes, whatever we were excited by, we would try to put it, we would put it in the land, in the trees, in the places around us. But it's a very different thing, I think, here in this country as opposed to in Hungary. It seems to me you were very fortunate to have those stories to mediate and connect you with the land around you.
Yes, yes, and I think that is very, there is there's a very strong power in knowing a story and standing in the place where the story happens. It's something that storytellers in Europe have worked with a lot in connecting the landscape or reconnecting the landscape with stories. And it's interesting because when I was growing up, I heard and read a lot of the Hungarian fairy tales that are actually divorced from the landscape, because you know that those classic big fairy tale types don't normally take place in any specific location. They are the type of stories that just takes place once upon a time, far, far away. So as a storyteller, I liked some of them, but they were not connected to specific places for me. And when I actually got a scholarship to go to the US and study there, I got an exchange student scholarship for a year. And I started meeting American storytellers and going to American storytelling events. I had to represent Hungarian culture. And I started, returning to Hungarian stories and picking the ones that I actually like and I enjoy telling. And that was when I started digging into the stories of my actual hometown and my actual birthplace. And those northwestern Hungarian riverlands have a very unique folklore, and they have a very unique folktale tradition. And suddenly I was finding all these stories that were actually connected to specific places that I knew and I grew up with. So I kind of came into this from the other way around. Once I was abroad, I started understanding why it is important to me to have my stories connected to the landscape of Hungary. And it was completely different to work with stories that had an actual landscape connection.
And you've done amazing work seeking out stories from all over the world, many of them being variations on classic fairy tales and stories that people know. What inspired you to do that work?
I like telling stories that not many people know. And I also never tell anything that I don't like. So there are many folk tales that I really enjoy, but there are parts of them that I just could not really get around, and I didn't really like them quite that way. And then I discovered that many folk tales have many variants that you can pick from. And there are, canonized versions like the Grimm version is what most people know of, Cinderella or Snow White. But there are many other variants of them. And actually, my next book that I'm publishing this year is going to be a collection of rare versions of well-known folk tales. So it's been a fascinating journey to go through. And folklorists have done the brunt of the work for me, because there are folktale catalogs that I can turn to, and they have a bibliography. And then my job is to find the books that they reference and read many versions of the same story. And it teaches you a lot about how folktales work and what is an essential part of a story that never changes from one version to the other. And then what are the parts that are there for color and for cultural reference, and those change from version to version. So reading a lot of different versions of a story give me an idea of how I can play around with this story, and what are the parts that I can change, or what are the parts that I can take from one version and tack it onto the other version of the story until I have a story variant that is actually mine and that I really enjoy telling.
And do you see these stories as entirely human creations, or are they expressions of something else, like a pattern in the natural world or something sacred?
I think they are very human, and there is a lot of humanness in seeing pattern and meaning, and personality. Humans love to give a personality to inanimate objects, and even you see a rock that looks in a specific way, and then you put a story to that rock. So I think it is deeply human, to look at it. The more you look into these stories, the more they talk about the human experience. um, and there's a lot of discussion among folklorists about where stories came from and whether they travel in a singular direction or whether they can be born the same way, independently from each other in different places at the same time. And there used to be, also, a theory that some of the stories that we tell come from dreams. And I have definitely encountered folk storytellers whose stories very much read like a dream experience. So that, to me, is kind of the boundary between, natural and supernatural, is when people dream about something and then that turns into a story. And often you don't even go into what the meaning of those, symbols are in a dreamlike story, but it's definitely something that we don't consciously think about.
As I'm sure you're aware, many folks these days in the US and in Europe, other places as well, feel that we should simply not tell these stories, that many of them are patriarchal and have outmoded ideas about gender and gender identity, and that we should simply start over and make up our own stories. What to you is the value of connecting with these older stories?
I think they resonate, with people because they are born from the human experience. But I do agree that there are many traditional stories that just don't speak to people the same way anymore. Hungarian tradition has a lot of stories about beating your wife, that I don't agree with and don't tell. Um, and we have a lot of discussions about, well, this is a part of our tradition and their ancestors left us these stories, and like, yeah, but still don't beat your wife. So there is an ongoing discussion, but I think folk storytelling is not really just about ready-made stories that you pass on. Folk storytelling, traditional storytelling, comes with a toolbox of symbols, of a way of telling, of a way of connecting. And you can use those building blocks, you can use those symbols, you can use those tropes, to build your own stories. It's basically a Lego type situation where you have a lot of, folktale motifs that are also numbered, are in a catalog. But I think what is very valuable in folktales is the way they don't speak about things directly. And because of that, they give you a much broader playground for interpretation and layers of meanings. And you can hear a folk tale repeatedly from different people or at different times of your life, and it will have vastly different meanings to you at any point, and different meanings to the person sitting next to you. So I think traditional storytelling is valuable because it is adaptable. It's always been adaptable. It's always changed over time and across cultures, and it can totally be used um, to speak to contemporary audiences as well, because it was designed to have all of these potential meanings and all of these tools to make it, symbolic and broader than just the specific things we want to say. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I guess what I'm wondering is, do you feel these stories have an intrinsic value, which is different in quality, different in kind from the stories that we could and do just make up ourselves in modern times?
Um, I think you absolutely can. Like, there are many, I don't know what you call them, original stories or literary stories, like stories with an author that somebody sat down and then just made them up, from scratch. And many of them have the same quality of speaking to a lot of people and taking on that meaning. Um, but there are also traditional stories that just keep coming back. I recently did this, reading challenge when I read a folktale collection from every country around the world. So that was 200 books. And there were stories that just kept coming up, in Oceania, in South America, in Europe, in Central Asia, and that same tale type just keeps coming back. And there has to be a reason that some of those just speak to people, and they survive for centuries in various places around the world because there is something in them that we just naturally enjoy. So I don't think it has to be either or. I think both of those things are important, and it's important for people to be creative and make new stories, and it's also important to pass on the ones that still carry meaning for us.
And do you feel there's a healing power in many of these stories?
Um, I believe so. Well, I currently work full time with the Világszép Foundation, which is a foundation that supports children in the foster system, in the Hungarian foster system. And our main tool is storytelling. And this foundation started out as a story therapy center 10 years ago. But then we left the therapy behind because we decided that these kids do get a lot of therapy, and that's not what they need from us. So Világszép's mentality right now is about providing acceptance, love, and personal attention to the children that we work with, because that's what they mostly lack in their everyday life. And our the way we work with stories is that we believe that they can have this calming effect of everything's going to be fine. The order in the world will be restored, and the hero will succeed, and people will find their fortune, and everything's going to be okay in the end. And that's why we actually, not all folktales end like that, but we only work with folktales that end like that, so that the kids, whenever we tell them stories, whenever I show up for bedtime stories, we do that every week at the group homes, they always know that they can relax and they can go through the story with me, and everything's going to be fine at the end. And just that structure, that order, that everything can be figured out, everything can be resolved, gives them that experience of a completely relaxing bedtime story when they don't have to worry about what's going to happen next. So I think that stories have a lot of therapeutic qualities just because of the way they are structured and the way they carry values of, things are going to be all right.
And Hungarian culture has a very shamanic background, as I understand it. Is that expressed in the stories in any way?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, we came from the east, probably from somewhere in Western Asia, eastern the steppes of Eastern Europe, and then we traveled for a couple of centuries, and we mixed with a lot of cultures, and then we arrived to the Carpathian Basin about 1100 years ago, and we settled, and we almost immediately became a Christian kingdom. And after that, the shamanistic tradition kind of started deteriorating as the country was Christianized. And some of it persisted way into the 20th century. We still have folk beliefs and folk legends about Taltos people, which is our word for shaman, and people who were born with a tooth, or people who were born with 6 fingers or an extra bone in their body were believed to have magic powers. And that belief still existed in the 20th century in many parts of Hungary. So some of it survived. Unfortunately, most of our mythology didn't, but we have elements of shamanistic mythology in our folk tales. So a lot of our folk tales have magic horses, sometimes with 7 legs. We have the world tree that reaches the sky, and there are levels on the world tree that the hero can climb, and there is the sun and the moon and the stars. So we have these cosmological motifs and symbols in our folk tales that maybe the storytellers didn't know the meaning anymore, but they still exist in our tales, and carry some of that old shamanistic tradition.
That's fascinating. And you've also done work with role playing games and storytelling, right? How do you see those two things relating?
Well, I wrote a dissertation on this. It's role playing was one of my first hobbies. I started playing D&D type tabletop role playing games in my teens, and I still play them. I love them. It's still one of my favorite hobbies, and it is collaborative storytelling. It's really fun because you spend time with a group of people and you are making up a story together, and you can make that story whatever you want it to be. That's why I always loved tabletop role playing more than video games, because video games can be very elaborate, but they do have set things that you can and cannot do. And in tabletop games, when you're just, telling a story together, you can make that story whatever you want. And it's, the only limit is your own imagination. So I was, I was a D&D storyteller before I was an actual storyteller. And I loved coming up with these adventures that I could play with my friends. So there's definitely a connection, and kids settle into role-playing games very naturally. I teach workshops in schools to children, where I teach them how to play role-playing games, and it just comes so easy to them to imagine and put themselves into the shoes of a character, and then to tell me what is going to happen next. And it's amazing. I love doing it, and it's definitely a form of collective storytelling.
And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your involvement with wizarding schools.
Yeah, the foundation I mentioned that I work with, we do summer camps. We have a place called the Story Center by Lake Balaton, which is a gorgeous part of Hungary. And we take the kids out of the foster homes by age group. And we have 6 or 7 camps every summer when we build the entire camp around a theme. So for the older kids, we have wilderness camps and career camps when they can try different professions. And we have art camps, arts and crafts camps. But every camp always has a theme of stories, and I have to put together a story collection for each camp, because we do tell stories every night, and sometimes even in the mornings. So one of these camps is for the age group 7 to 10, 7 to 11, and that's what we call the actual story camp. And this year, story camp is going to be a wizarding school. It's going to be a Hungarian wizarding school. So it's going to be built around Hungarian wizard folklore and the folklore of Hungarian magicians, Táltos, Garabonciás, which is our weather wizards in Hungarian folklore. So it's going to be a Garabonciás school where they can learn about Hungarian folklore magic. Basically, there's going to be stories about dragons, because Garabonciás wizards can ride the dragons. That's one of their superpowers. And magicians, and also the story that I just told you about the woman who turns everybody into flowers. That is also going to be one of the stories for the camp. So this is going to be a 5-day summer camp, and we are going to play a lot of games and tell a lot of stories and just have a lot of fun with this.
That's very cool. Now, you tell stories in several different languages. Is there a difference for you? Does it feel different to tell a story in Hungarian as opposed to English, for example?
Yes. Although at this point I am basically bilingual. I've been learning English since first grade, and my husband is American, so we speak English in the home. So it's my second native language at this point. So when I tell in English, I don't have to think about the words anymore. I can improvise in English. I also tell in Spanish, but whenever I have a Spanish performance, I have to prepare. I can't improvise that well in Spanish yet, so I'm working on that. But I love telling in Spanish, so it's always worth the extra preparation. But it is different. Hungarian folktales have a specific language, turns of phrases that traditional storytellers use. And I don't quite tell completely like a folk teller. I use my own words and my own style in my storytelling, but there are more things in terms of language that a Hungarian audience expects from a Hungarian storyteller. And then in English, I tell less folksy, I guess that would be the official term. My English telling is a lot less folksy than the Hungarian one.
Yeah. So in Hungarian, audiences expect certain repeated phrases and things like that.
Yes, yes. Sometimes they even expect a dialect, but I don't have a Hungarian accent, I guess, because the part of Hungary where I grew up is the part that kind of turned into standard Hungarian that you hear on TV. So my natural Hungarian accent is not really recognizable to most people because they just hear it as standard Hungarian. But some audiences would expect a real traditional storyteller to have a Transylvanian dialect or a Northern Hungarian dialect. So they sometimes expect this very traditional language with this recognizable dialect that makes them feel like it is a more authentic folk tale experience.
Can you give us an example of like a repeated phrase or a beginning or ending of a Hungarian story?
Yeah, I can do a beginning. Egyszer volt, hol nem volt. Még az óperenciás tengeren is túl, még az üveghegyeken is túl, ott, ahol a kurtafarkú kismalacka túr. And that that is once upon a time. It's once upon a time. There was and there wasn't. Technically, it's how our story started. There was and there wasn't. Far, far away across the Óperenciás Sea, beyond the Glass Mountain, in a place where the curly-tailed piglet roots around. And I don't know what the piglet is doing there. I think it's there for the rhyme more than anything, but that's how our stories traditionally start, is the Óperenciás Sea and the Glass Mountains.
And what sea is that again?
Óperenciás tenger.
Okay.
It's Óperenciás is the name, and some folklorists say that it's derived from a county in Austria, which is across the river. So, 200 years ago, for Hungarian soldiers that were taken to army service to Austria, that was far, far, far away from home. So it's not the Óperenciás Sea is supposed to be the edge of the world, but actually it's in Austria.
So instead of once upon a time, you say it was and it was not in Hungarian. So are these stories true? What do you think? I mean, is that even a question?
My favorite response that I've ever heard, this is not mine, I forget who I heard it from, but somebody said they might not have happened, but they are definitely true.
I like that. And what sort of spiritual environment were you in growing up? And how does that influence your storytelling?
Very Catholic. The kind of, Catholic bordering on pagan. When you have like the blessed flowers from church and then you do all kinds of stuff with them at home. And, you have to draw a cross on the bread before you cut the bread. So like the kind of old school Catholic that borders on pagan. But yeah, I went to a Catholic school. 11 years of my grade school life was in a Catholic school that was actually a fairly liberal international Catholic school. So it's not how I come to discover most of my American friends don't imagine Catholic school like that. But my family, especially my father's parents, are very religious. So I grew up going to the village church and going to all of these, going to mass on all of the holidays and having all of these rituals that surround Catholic practice. That's how I grew up.
Yeah. So many of the stories you tell, do they feel to you like something that is a further expression of that Catholic worldview, or are they opposed to that worldview?
It's a mix. It's really a mix. I am still spiritual. I'm not necessarily religious, but I'm still spiritual. But I feel like it is a very deeply ingrained part of our folklore. So you would have a folk tale where the devil is kidnapping somebody's wife, and then the Virgin Mary looks out of heaven and she sees what's happening, and she comes down and she beats up the devil and saves the woman. So these characters. Saint Peter shows up a lot in our folk tales. Jesus shows up in a lot of our folk tales as a trickster character. So Christian mythology figures into Hungarian folklore, and it's just a part of. And then our old time shamanism figures into how we understand Christianity. For example, Hungarians call the Virgin Mary Boldogasszony, which literally means happy woman. And Boldogasszony was probably some kind of a fertility goddess before we became Christian, and then her name got tacked onto the Virgin Mary. So it's, it goes both ways in terms of mixing different cultural traditions, but it's definitely something that is part of our folklore.
Yeah. And you, as we've said, you've done amazing work seeking out alternative versions of famous folk stories. But at least in my experience here in America, the Christian story is one to which there really isn't supposed to be alternative versions, right? Because that's all fact, that's history, as a way of thinking.
Yeah.
And so you can't find a version where Jesus has a sister or whatever, something like that. Is that your understanding of that relationship, or how do you navigate those two things?
Hungarian folklore gets very creative at that. We actually have a book. It is a delightful collection of folk legends, and it's called The Peasant's Bible. And it's legends that were collected from folk storytellers, 100, 200 years ago, who interpreted what they heard in church. And, they interpreted Bible stories. And especially when it gets to creation and Adam and Eve, there are many, many really fun stories about how things came to be the way they are. So we have we have all of these folk tales about Jesus and Saint Peter walking the earth together, and then they run into all kinds of trouble, and they create things and they change things, and Saint Peter chews bread in secret, and whenever Jesus talks to him, he has to spit it out in secret, and that's how mushrooms were created, from like chewed bread that he spat out. So we have a lot of stories that have really nothing to do with the Bible, but they are like a delightful religious legend tradition.
And are there people or institutions who either in the past or now feel threatened by these stories or not?
I'm sure that there were some people who grumbled about this at some point, but this was such a part of a storyteller's repertoire. I don't think anybody took these stories too seriously, but they are really fun stories to explain how and why. And I don't think it was ever really persecuted.
Yeah. And when you talk about these stories being in the land, being connected with certain hills and rivers and forests, is that a liberating thing to you, or does it feel like it shuts you out? Because I could see how if a story happened in a certain place at a certain hill, in a way that could prevent you from unlocking that story, from feeling it in your own backyard. But to you, it sounds like it feels like more a liberating effect. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes, I think it is. I think people need to fill the landscape with stories around them, which is why in places where the stories didn't survive, people tell a lot of ghost stories, because the fastest way to fill up a place with a story is with ghosts. And I've seen this in the US a lot of times. Like, there are so many ghost stories in the US, it's ridiculous. And Hungarian folklore doesn't have ghosts. We don't. We have fairies and witches and wizards. We don't really have. There's like one type of ghost that I can think of that we have in Hungarian folklore. But there is a need to fill, to point and say, over there, this happened. And even when my grandfather was telling stories, and he was telling the same folktale type that you hear with the Hódja Radin, and then you hear in Ireland with somebody else. And my grandfather would tell me, well, my grandfather lived in this house and this is where it happened. So you would connect all of his stories to specific places that he could point at. And And I think it's fun. I think it makes it comfortable to be surrounded by stories and visual reminders of stories. And I'm always very happy when I find a story like that. So it's really fun for me to do the research and do the digging and go into the archives that never got published, and then find the stories and reconnect them to places.
Yeah. And you seem like someone uniquely positioned to answer this question, which is, what are the differences between storytelling in America and storytelling in Hungary or Europe? Because you spent quite a bit of time in the US. What do you think?
Well, one of the things that was super new to me when I first went to the US was the personal storytelling movement, because my grandfather did tell a lot of stories about himself and his family, but being a personal storyteller as a profession is something that is not really known in Hungary. I don't think it's much known in Europe either. I know some European storytellers who tell personal stories, but not to the degree that it exists in the US. So that was really strange to me at first, and then I grew to like it, and now there are American storytellers who tell personal stories that I really love to listen to. Um, so that was one of the big differences. European tellers in general, Hungarian tellers in particular, are much more traditional, or about ancient wisdom and your own cultural folk tradition.
What are you working on now that is exciting for you?
I've published folktale collections that I've researched and put together, both in Hungarian and in English. And right now, my next book that I'm working on is going to be the first book that is going to be my own stories. And it's still going to be folktales, but they are going to be folktales that I have retold so much or changed so much that I can't really say they are folktales anymore. And I don't want to misrepresent the culture. So it might be inspired by a German folktale, but I have changed it so much that I can say, here is a story from Germany, because that would be untrue. So this is going to be my first book that is a collection of stories that I have retold and reshaped. And I'm very excited about that, because it gives me a lot more creative freedom than when I am trying to represent actual folk traditions.
Yeah, that sounds great. And you wrote a book about superpowered people, right? As well, like folk
Yeah.
superheroes. That sounds amazing. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean I love comics. I love superhero stories. And when I was studying at ETSU in Johnson City, I had this school residency. So I got to tell a lot of stories to the same kids. And we ended up having this game where I would ask them what superpower they would pick for themselves. And I had a repertoire of folk tales that have the same powers in them, so that I could say, like, hey, you want to fly? Here's a story about flying. And I could make that connection so that they would be more open to hearing these old stories or hearing folk tales. It's especially good with teenagers, because teenagers often think that folk tales are for children, fairy tales are for children, we don't want to hear those. So we start talking about superpowers, and then I show them that the same superpowers have existed for hundreds of years, because people have always dreamed about having these powers.
yeah.
And that's what the book was made of. It was my repertoire of superhero stories that I collected into one book.
Cool. Do you find risk or danger in your work in any way for you personally? Like what's risky for you now in storytelling? Oh,
Well, right now, it's not really risky, but I am paying more and more attention to representation and what kinds of stories I tell and how those represent different groups of people. So I think this is a conversation that European storytellers started having in the past few years, of how we represent minorities in our stories, or who is missing from our stories. And right now, Hungary is really rolling back the LGBT rights, for example. So me as a storyteller now have a responsibility to pay very close attention to representation and what I want to represent as an artist, as a human being, as a storyteller, with the stories that I do tell. So I have to look at how these things can be done well and done well with the conscience. And it's definitely a very hot topic in Hungary right now. So,
And you've done great work finding stories with gender fluidity and gender switching in them, I believe. True? Um,
yeah, I've looked into those, and the thing is with my research is I can dig up at least one story for most any topic because world folklore is huge and very rich. But me like finding one tale for a specific topic or a specific identity for like weeks and weeks of research does not mean that we don't need more of them. It's actually, to me, that signals that if I had to spend several hours finding one story about something, that's definitely, there is a need to have more of those. And then we circle back to the topic of making up new stories, because there are definitely topics these days that could definitely use more stories in the storytelling repertoire.
yeah, yeah. Is there a story or a myth in which you feel most at home? Like that's where you, if it were a landscape, is that where you want to dwell?
Yeah, going back to the Irish hero tales, that's what I grew up with is Fionn McCool, and Fianna stories, and that's my, um, I don't know, my comfort zone, and I reread a lot of those Fionn McCool stories. It's like comfort food whenever I feel upset or I need inspiration. And I have that landscape, I have the characters down, but sometimes I go digging and find a couple of new stories that I haven't read before, and that's always really exciting. It's like when your favorite movie gets a sequel, or your favorite show gets a new season. It's an ongoing thing, but that's definitely one of my favorite imaginary places to inhabit.
Well, Csenge, thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
My guest today has been Csenge Zalka, a Hungarian storyteller and a researcher, a deep spelunker into the great mountain of stories of this world. You can find out more about her work at her blog, which is multicoloreddiary.blogspot.com. That's multicoloreddiary.blogspot.com. There's a great deal of info there and many stories from around the world on that site. And I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Thank you for joining me today. There are more stories on my website, which is jleeming.com. Thanks, as always, to the beautiful, wonderful tribe of Patreon supporters who helped to make this podcast happen. If you were able to join them, please do so. You can do that via my website and via Patreon. Thanks very much for joining me, and may we all see the big trees around us and find ourselves in the wild seas when we least expect it, but perhaps most need it. Thank you for listening to this, and take care.